good news is that I had time to make slides. The even better news is I decided not to show them to you. I'm not going to bore you with slides. I will occasionally refer to them for my own notes, but I'm not going to make you read a lot of text. I know it's late in the day and you all have better things to do than watch TV. So, a bit of background. I work for the Software Freedom Law Center. We are a nonprofit, pro bono law firm based out of New York. We represent free and open source software projects. We do it on a pro bono basis, which means we don't take their money. We are a nonprofit institution, which means that we don't make a lot of money, but at the same time, we are also a law firm, which means that all of our activities are really driven by the needs of specific clients. So the things I'm going to talk a lot about today are really informed by my daily work, which is work with free software clients, with people who are actually making free software, trying to distribute it to the world, and in the context of their specific view of what is going on and what is working well and what is not working well. So that's sort of the approach that I take to free software and also to the wider world of Creative Commons and freedom to share issues that we're going to talk about tonight. So that's the background. And I want to take a little bit of a poll, just so that I have a little background on you. What I want to know from the people in this room is how many people are familiar with the term open source software? Show of hands, show of hands. Great, great, that's all of you. How many people are familiar with the term free software? Wonderful. And how many of you understand that there's a difference between free software and open source software from a philosophical perspective? Great, great, okay, so this is good. How many of you know what the letters GPL stand for? Oh, wonderful. Okay, so I will explain a little bit about such things as I go through for the benefit of some people who don't have that background, but I'm going to assume that you have a lot of this background already. I wasn't quite sure what the level of familiarity with some of these concepts would be, but it's obvious that you guys are pretty well versed in at least the basic terrain of what we're going to talk about tonight. So, a few years ago, President Bush, at what in retrospect came to look like the start of the Iraq War, he landed a plane on an aircraft carrier, and he got out and he spoke in front of a giant banner that said, "Mission accomplished." And that was his sort of view of the Iraq War, right? We had done a certain amount of work, things were looking good, and in retrospect, mission accomplished has come to mean, okay, we've done something, but there's a whole lot more to do. And that's sort of a concept that we can apply to the free and open source software movement, right? Mission accomplished. Yay, mission accomplished. We've got open source software in every place that we have computing resources. GNU Linux, free and open source software, is on the desktop. It's on servers, it's on embedded devices, it's on your cell phones, which are just, of course, computers that you carry around in your pocket, right? They're primitive computers, but they're still computers, and they're going to get more and more sophisticated as time goes by. We've got our software in businesses, we've got our software in homes, we've got our software in schools, in hospitals, in nonprofit institutions. Everywhere anybody could have a computer, we have free and open source software. We've got GNU/Linux, but we've also got free and open source software on the Windows platform. We've got free and open source software on the Macintosh platform. I'm sure a lot of people in here use things like Firefox and OpenOffice, or MPlayer, or VLC, or even just use Samba to talk to your back-end network if you're using it in a commercial context. So yes, mission accomplished. Free software has penetrated the world to a very high degree, to a degree that people didn't necessarily think was possible even just 10 years ago. Certainly not 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And the question that we've come up with is, now that you've achieved a certain amount of success, and we're not going to claim that we've scaled every peak that we intended to scale, but now that we've achieved this certain amount of success, people are sort of wondering how did we get there? how did we create this level of success with free and open source software, and how can we create that level of success and expand it into other areas, right? We can distribute software, we can make it according to this distributed model of production, and we can give it away under these specific licensing terms, and people will use it, deploy it in businesses and in their personal life, and that's already starting to grow more and more. It's not going to decrease. We're on a virtuous cycle of increasing use and production of free and open source software. But can we do it with anything other than software? How many people here have heard of the Creative Commons? Good, good. Not quite as many as have heard of the GPL, but a significant amount. And Creative Commons, I would argue, is a pretty good example of a movement trying to replicate what we're doing in the free software world. And we're going to talk a lot more about that later. But it's only one of the many different commonses, open areas that are trying to exist. We've got people working on open hardware, now that we have open source software, right? Open source hardware. Open educational resources. People try to produce textbooks and curricula that people can use in all sorts of areas under terms that look a lot like open source sharing. They want a distributed model of development. They want licensing terms that let everyone use it, require some give back. All the sorts of tools that we're using in the software world, people want to start applying to other worlds because they want to achieve the benefits that we've achieved. They want the efficiencies, and they want the uptake, and they want the distribution. And of course, they want the neat stuff that results. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to look at some of the things that have created the success of free software. And then we're going to look at how Creative Commons has tried to replicate the movement. And then we're going to talk a little bit generally about where Creative Commons is doing it differently, and then how other movements can follow along. So that's the general structure of the conversation we're going to have tonight. If at any point anybody has any questions, you should feel free to just raise your hand or even just interrupt me. So we can have this as a dialogue. I don't want to just talk to you guys all night. I do want to hear back from you what you're thinking. I think it'll make this a whole lot more interesting, if not for you, than for me. So let's talk about the GPL. The GPL is a license. It stands for General Public License. It is published and produced by the Free Software Foundation. We are on version 3 of this license. Version 2 of this license dates back to the early 90s. It's 16 years old, 17 years old. And this is the sort of genesis of the modern free software movement as we have it today. It is the most prominent feature of the free software movement, right? When you get a piece of free software, it is more than likely GPL. It is more than likely using the GPL as its license. Now, there are other free and open source licenses, right? There's the BSD licenses, there's the Mozilla public license. I mean, there's a whole constellation of licenses, and we're going to talk about a lot of these other licenses. But the GPL is sort of the standard bearer, the first thing people think of when they think of open source licensing. But it's not just the first thing they think of when they think of open source licensing. It's often the first thing people think of when they think open source. The first thing that people think of when they talk about free and open source software is that this is software distributed under specific types of licenses. Licensing has come to be a big part of how we distribute software. It's a big part of what defines the movement. It's a big part of how we understand the story of open source software. The story of open source software has been the story of the development of a bunch of licenses. I mean, arguably the biggest news in free software last year was GPL version 3. The focus on licensing has led to a situation where, I mean, a lot of people believe that the licenses are a big part of the success of free software. And my argument here tonight, one of the arguments I want to make to you guys is that there is a overemphasis on the licensing terms. That we think too much of our licenses. That licenses are easy, but community is hard. It's easy to write a license, so we write licenses. And the success of the movement has come partly from the fact that we have licenses, but there are all these other pieces that I want to identify, that I want to draw out so that we can see the different way these pieces function. We're going to identify the pieces of the foundation of open source software. And I think the first thing I need to do is probably to explain to you why licensing hasn't been this great thing. I mean, I'm sure you guys, as people who have heard of the GPL and are familiar with it, have an idea that the GPL is one of the foremost pieces of the free software movement and one of the greatest reasons why the movement has been a success. And I think there's some truth there, but I want to unpack it and take the air out of that balloon just a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to say is that nobody knows what license they're using. Right? Licenses are really important, and yet nobody actually knows what license they're using. I shouldn't say nobody, but a great number of people don't.
You mean using?
As in, I have clients.
When they license their own software or when
Yes.
they use the software?
Both. Both on the end users have no idea what the license of the underlying product is, and that's okay. They don't really need to. Distributors very often don't look at licenses. Developers very often don't look at licenses. When they're grabbing software from the internet and dumping it into their product and getting it out the door, very often they don't even know what license they themselves are distributing their own project under. A lot of times clients come to me for help, and one of the first questions they want to know is, what is our license? They've got some sort of license statement in a file, but it might be accurate, it might not be accurate. It might be old, it might be new, it might refer to this piece, it might refer to that piece, but nobody actually knows. And they've been operating in a mode where they're distributing their product, distributing their software, sometimes for years, without a clear understanding of what license they're using. Without ever seeing a need to tackle this problem. It's not until they come to us where suddenly we start asking questions about legal situations that they realize that they have no idea what their license is. And especially in the wake of GPL version 3, when suddenly we have two different versions of the GPL, there are a ton of GPL projects that don't know what license they are using. There are a ton of GPL projects that come to me and say, are we version 2? Or are we 2 or later? Can we use version 3? Are we compatible with version 3? And sometimes it's different parts of the project have different answers. Right? People don't know what license they're using. And so far, without any sort of ill effect. I mean, nobody really notices that there's all this ignorance of the basic licenses being used, because it doesn't actually have a practical effect 99% of the time. So nobody knows their license. To the extent people know what license they're using, a lot of times they haven't read the license. How many people here have read the GPL? A lot more people here have heard of the GPL than have read it. How many people here have read GPL version 3? What about the LGPL? You're all lying. You're all lying. You have not read LGPL. You think you know what it says, but you have not read it. And I would lay money on that. I really would. Because you are either so statistically improbable as to my having lucked out that I should immediately quit here and go straight to the nearest casino. Well, you're lying. And I'm gonna bet on that. Some of you are lying. Maybe not all of you, but some of you are definitely lying. I mean, the number of people who think they know what's in that license but have not actually read it is... The point is that we all think we know what the licenses say. We have an intuitive sense of what's in the license because we talk to other people who use it. We know what the standards are. We know when people say to us, I can do X, I can't do X, this is a violation, that's permissible, this is a requirement. We hear about these things. We learn about the content of the licenses from our peers in the same way that we learn about laws from the world around us, right? We all know that, say, insider trading is illegal, murder is illegal. Not many of us have read the actual statutes that say murder is illegal. Not many of us have read the actual cases that talk about what is insider trading, what is not insider trading. But we all know that generally speaking, there is something called insider trading, and we can identify it, and it's bad, don't do it. And that's a lot of people's relationship to the GPL. Even if they know that they're using that license, they haven't read it. They don't feel like they need to. They feel like they know what is in that license by virtue of their membership in this community, by virtue of there being people who use that license around them and they tell each other what it means, and they come to a sort of social agreement on what it means. If we all in this room agree that the GPL specifies, say, only non-commercial use, well, as long as our activity doesn't really rub up against people outside of this room, or people try to use the license in a different way, I guess the license does sort of say that for our purposes. I mean, if one of us were to actually read it, we would discover that's not what the license says, but, we could probably go years without discovering that. And I have clients who have gone years without discovering this. And that brings me to the next point, right? Nobody knows what license they're using. Nobody reads the license. Those that read the license don't understand the license. GPL version 2 is not the hardest license in the world to understand. It is a bit longer than most of the BSD style licenses. But it's not necessarily the easiest thing to understand all the way through in all its complexity on first read. Most people who have read the GPL have only read it once. I would wager that the drop-off between people who have read it, between 0 and 1 times, 1 and 2 times, 2 and 3 times, it probably drops pretty steeply. I'm guessing. I mean, I read the GPL for a living, so I've read it a number of times, but I'm guessing a lot of other people don't find it quite as fascinating as I do. Maybe some of you do. I hope so, because that would be kind of interesting to me. But, most people have only read it once and, maybe given it a quick read, not necessarily studied it, looked it up, tried to figure out what it means and its complexities and its corners and its shadows. Most people don't do that. If they have read the license, they have a beginning of an understanding of it. They don't have a sophisticated understanding of it, and sometimes they have an incorrect understanding of the license. There is a client of the Software Freedom Law Center who insists that if you distribute his GPL software in unmodified form, you don't need to deliver source code with it, which is, frankly, just the exact opposite of what the license says. But I don't know if he's read the license. He claims to have read the license. And he obviously doesn't understand the license, but he's really, really sure of what it means to him. And so as far as he's concerned, when he goes and looks around the world, as far as the GPL that exists in his mind is the GPL he's going to enforce in the world. And he's not going to enforce the provisions regarding source code unless you distribute a modified version. So, for him, his GPL is different than my GPL. His GPL is different than other people's GPL. And that's just life. That's just a reality of it. The license term is gone. And there's nothing anyone can do about it, because as much as I can insist to him that there are clauses in the license that say otherwise, he is fairly sure that he's right, and that he doesn't need to listen to what I have to say on the matter. And that's his right. And what that shows you is that even people on the same team disagree about what the license says, disagree about how to understand this license. So we're not operating within the same world when we talk about GPL. It means a different thing to him than it does to me, than it does to the guy down the hall. Another example from another license is the BSD license. There was a controversy within the free and open source software community less than a year ago that involved a fairly prominent author of a BSD-style licensed software package who was unhappy that people were taking his BSD code, putting it into GPL software, and using it without contributing the changes back to him under a BSD license. And what this means is that people were taking his software, shunting it into GPL projects, improving it, but he couldn't use those changes to improve his own version. And he felt that GPL authors had a moral obligation under the license, a moral and legal obligation under the BSD license to contribute back their changes, which is, quite frankly, the exact opposite of what the BSD style licenses say. There's no BSD style license that comes anywhere near implying that this is a clause. But he is a man who very publicly insisted that these conditions existed and also insisted that these conditions be met. Nobody understands their licenses. They have an idea in their mind of what the license means. It sometimes matches reality, sometimes it doesn't. So nobody knows what license they're using, nobody reads their license, nobody understands their license, and finally, nobody enforces the license. In the time that we have had GPL version 2, there have been 4 lawsuits filed in America. As far as I know, 0 in England to enforce the license. 4 in 17 years. And you know something? All 4 of these were filed late last year by my law firm, right? So, I mean, if we had just sort of decided to do things a little bit differently, the number would be 0. 0. Yes, there is a lot of enforcement activity. There are a lot of letters that go back and forth, emails, phone calls. But the number of people hopping into court and enforcing the license is very, very, very low. Which means that the number of people using the license as a legal instrument in a court of law is so low as to be negligible. The document functioning as a license in the sense of giving limited rights that you can then go to a government and enforce the limitations upon, that just doesn't happen very often. So the license getting used as a license is something that happens at the edges, at the margins. But as a legal instrument, once in a while. Very, very rarely. And so what happens is that most compliance is voluntary. I mean, it's sort of like taxes in America. I mean, if you don't pay your taxes, eventually you might get in trouble, but the fact is the entire tax system works because 99.999% of people just fill out the form and pay it every year. They couldn't possibly go after everyone and make everyone pay. And it's the same thing with the GPL. I mean, we couldn't go after everyone and make them comply. But people comply voluntarily. People comply because there is, community pressure. People comply because even if they know they're never going to get caught, they agree with our ideals. They want to participate in what we're doing. They want to give back. But they're not complying because of a fear of enforcement. Sure, some people are. But the vast majority of activity in free and open source software is not a fear of what happens if you don't comply. It's about what's so good when you do contribute, when you do participate. It's not that people fear the stick, it's that they really like carrots. So what we want to do is go back to what we were saying earlier, right? Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. We've got a license that people are using. I mean, compliance is the norm in most contexts. And adoption of GPL software, of free and open source software, is increasing in every context. In every context imaginable, we are on the upswing. So mission accomplished. Despite the fact that the license is problematic, despite the fact that nobody reads it, nobody understands it, nobody enforces it, it's working. And I guess the question that I want to ask tonight is, why is all this stuff working? I mean, if the license is so riddled with holes, is not functional in so many different directions, why is it working so well? And the answer is going to be that, there are other forces at play that prop up the license and that make it work. So what happens when you have mission accomplished is that we have success, but there's still more work to do, right? We defined a mission accomplished as that at the beginning of the evening. And the more work to do in this case is to ask, what are these other forces? The first one is the 4 freedoms. Does everyone here know what the 4 freedoms are? Familiar with the phrase 4 freedoms? I stumped you, finally, finally. Okay, so the free software movement sort of started in Boston with the Free Software Foundation. They started writing software, giving it away under the GPL version 1 and version 2. And at some point, they articulated some ethics, some morals, some freedoms. They explained what was so important about software freedom. What was so important about the freedom to use this software in this particular way? And they identified 4 very specific things. The freedom to run the software. The freedom to share the software with other people. The freedom to modify the software. And the freedom to distribute those modified versions. 4 essential freedoms that form the moral case for free software. The case for why this stuff is good on an ethical level, not just a practical level. And it took them a long time to get to the point where they could articulate these freedoms. I think they were always animated by this, but it was years, many years before they came to these specific values. So, a lot of people participate in free software because they believe in these principles as ethics, as moral imperatives. There are a lot of people participating in free software because they believe that it is right and good that these types of freedoms should exist, and that we should protect these freedoms, and that we should enhance these freedoms, and we should not participate in using or promoting software that retards these freedoms, that there is some moral wrong involved in working against these freedoms. And this belief animates some of the most passionate people in the movement, the people who tend to make the movement a part of their lives. And I could talk for a very long time about why these freedoms are important, but that's a whole nother discussion. For now, all I want to say is that these freedoms are there, people respond to them, and they animate a large part of the policy that goes into this free software movement. The protecting the freedom as the underlying principle behind everything we do actually explains a lot of the policy decisions that have been made within this world. So the second foundational piece is rip, mix, and burn, right? Sharing is cool. Sharing is the logical endpoint of creation. There's not a lot of point to creating something unless you share it. Creation, for one, is just not that interesting. There are a lot of people involved in the free software movement, both as producers, distributors, and end users, who are in this game specifically because they really, really, really want to create something and then have other people enjoy their creation. That is their artistic and technical fulfillment. To create something and to give it away is what they're interested in. They don't care so much about the freedom. They're not ideological in quite that manner. They just really enjoy this sort of creation and giving it away. And maybe this sort of sharing generates economic benefits for them, whatever. The point is that it's the ability to share efficiently that is motivating an awful lot of people to be interested in what we're doing. The third powerful piece that drives free software is that we don't just advocate for freedom, we produce it, right? I mean, the way this all started, historically, was Richard Stallman sat down and wrote a set of software called the GNU tools. He didn't just say, we need free software, somebody should make free software, hey you, free your software, hey you, don't make free software. He actually went out and did it. He actually provided this stuff. And what happened was, he didn't just create his software. Because of the freedom principles we talked about earlier, he attached conditions to building on it that maintained freedom for downstream users. This resulted in more software being created, to the point where we now have an ecosystem, which is a term Richard Stallman does not like so much, but I'm going to use it because I think it's pretty accurate. We have an ecosystem where it is more efficient on multiple levels to create software within our structure than without. We have an ecosystem where if you want to build something from scratch, that's hard. But if you want to build something on top of our libraries and our other software, that's comparatively easier. And so people tend to keep building. And what started out as a bunch of GNU tools has gone up the chain to the point where you had libraries, you had operating systems, you have desktops, you have applications, and basically any type of software that exists within the space of free and open source software. So you have three pieces. The freedoms, the sharing, and the ecosystem. And I think the key point about the ecosystem was that the ecosystem suddenly made sense to a lot of people. People who don't care so much about sharing and don't care so much about freedoms, they'll get into it because the economics make sense. They'll get into it because the ecosystem is powerful. It's a powerful engine for whatever they're trying to accomplish, whether that be business or artistic or scholastic or what have you, social, political. They're in it for the efficiencies. And by creating an ecosystem, we attracted a whole bunch of people into the movement who don't share our values. We've attracted a bunch of people who don't care about freedom. And I think that's an interesting piece to think about now that we have all these people here who are not all about freedom first, who don't care so much about sharing. And how to keep those people involved is definitely one of the questions that we have to answer as we go forward and think about what keeps all of this running, what keeps this ecosystem alive. But the ecosystem is the point where you get explosive growth. The ecosystem is the piece that gets more and more people involved, that gets lots and lots of production, resources, building on top of each other until it keeps growing higher and higher and keeps convincing more and more people to get involved. This is sometimes known as network effects, right? Is everyone here familiar with the term network effects? Network effects are basically, you have a bunch of people who are in a network and they can talk to each other efficiently, so it becomes hard to do something outside of the network, which is an incentive for you to join the network, which makes the network bigger. And so network effects are self-perpetuating, and if they get strong enough, it becomes impossible to build something outside of that network. So, 4 freedoms, sharing, and ecosystem. Another way of saying ecosystem is we have the best toys, right? We have really good technology, and if you want to come play with our toys, you have to come play with our toys underneath our terms. And the way you build the ecosystem is through these steps, right? You start with these freedoms. The freedom creates a situation that lets people share efficiently, which creates an ecosystem because if you want to contribute, if you want to play and contribute to the sharing, you have to contribute under the same terms as everyone else. So, mission accomplished. Again, we founded a community on ethics, a community on love of sharing, and a community on great technology. But where's the license in all this? I mean, in that story of we started with freedom, sharing became cool, and the freedom created an ecosystem because everyone had to keep contributing, we didn't really talk about the license. Because as it turns out, the license is a metaphor for all of these other things. When I say GPL, the lights that go off in your brain contain a mixture of these concepts that I just spoke about. When you say GPL, this is a shorthand for copyleft, a shorthand for freedom, right? A shorthand for lots of people sharing their software with other people. This is a shorthand for the amazing ecosystem that has been built on top of GPL software. So when we talk about the license, when we talk about the GPL, the BSD license, any other license, what we're talking about is this foundation, these 3 things. And my argument here tonight really is that if you want to build something that is successful in the way the free software movement is successful, you need to not think so much about the license as you need to think about these three foundational concepts. These three pieces make for a strong freedom to share movement in whatever wing of freedom to share you want, in whatever you're sharing.
Isn't the license really more of, isn't it, let's maybe think of it as like an insurance policy that protects those concepts?
Yes.
And that's why most of us don't know the detail of it. It's there just in case, rather than at the forefront.
Yeah, and I think that's right. The question was, isn't it better to think of the GPL or the license as an insurance policy that's there to back up these foundational concepts? And I think there's definitely a lot of truth to the point of view that the backup is there, and we want the backup to be there. We want it to be correct when we need it, but we don't need it very often because it's in the background. I would argue, though, that because of all the things I talked about earlier, the focus on the backup, the focus on your insurance policy is probably less important than the focus on building your foundation, right? If you want to build a strong house, you don't start with a really good homeowner's insurance policy. If you want to build a really strong house, you start with a really strong foundation. So, freedom to share. That's what this is all about. We want to share all different things. And mission accomplished. We've got the success. Yay, free software works. So we're going to create the Creative Commons. Let me tell you what the Creative Commons is, because there were some people here who didn't raise their hand when I asked if you were familiar with it. So the Creative Commons was started by a man named Larry Lessig, who was on the board of the Free Software Foundation, no longer, is currently on the board of my law firm, and he's a Stanford law professor. He founded the Creative Commons. What the Creative Commons is an attempt to clone free software by swapping out the word software and swapping in photos, literature, music, video. The idea is to create an ecosystem or an ability to share a bunch of media materials that people can then rip, mix, burn, build on top of to create a creative renaissance. If you look around, certainly in America, certainly to a degree in Europe, copyright law is increasingly locking down media properties, right? Between copyright law and digital rights management, it's sometimes hard to legally get at material to build upon to create new creative and cultural works. Creative Commons was a way to create a commons, a pool of creative works that people could contribute to and take out. So they're not the only ones. We also have something called open hardware. There are people who want to swap out the word software and swap in the word hardware. They would like to see a renaissance in hardware development, in making chips. And they believe that if they could get engineers, electrical engineers, and mechanical engineers hacking on robotic systems and chips, then we can produce explosive growth in this area, distributed models of production in this area. So there's people trying to do what we did in software, in hardware, and that's a very natural development. It's not a new one. People have been working on it at a low level for a long time. In addition to the Creative Commons, there's also the Science Commons, which is people trying to take scientific ideas, academic research, and contribute it to a common pool, to publish it together in an open way that lets everybody pull from that pool. Instead of publishing scientific findings in journals that sit on a shelf and no one ever reads because they're too expensive, or locked away in databases that most people don't have access to, or worse yet, locked in your company's vault because they don't want to expose the world to whatever they found, or they don't think they can monetize it, or whatever. That's not scientific advancement. That inability to share information with other scientists retards scientific advancement. So there are people who want to create a science commons, a way to pool their scientific resources and knowledge to produce new research. Like I said earlier, there's also the open educational resources movement, which tries to make curricula and textbooks. And then there's open maps. I don't know if you know, this is actually really cool. There's the beginnings of copyright law in America were really kind of focused on maps, right? America was this vast continent where no one really knew what was out there. And one of the ways that people financed the ability to go exploring was to come home and sell maps to what they found. Hey, look, I found, you know, this mountain and that area around it, and I'm going to tell you how to get around it. And a lot of early copyright law was really used to protect these maps. Because it turns out that going and mapping something is time intensive. It's labor intensive. It used to be dangerous. It's less dangerous now depending on what neighborhood you're in. But it used to be dangerous, right? Who knows what's around the next corner? And from that early beginning of people carefully husbanding their knowledge of topographical features and other people's ability to reproduce it, we've had several hundred years of husbanding that very knowledge to today, where maps are still very expensive to make. And if you want to use a map of the land, you either have to go and scout the area yourself, figure out what it looks like and reproduce it on paper, or you have to license the map from some company. And in an age where mobile computing is getting more and more sophisticated, where every single one of our phones is going to have a GPS in it. I mean, not all of us will be able to use the GPS, but the government at least will be able to use the GPS in your phone, right? Everyone will have a GPS on their person because almost everybody has a cell phone. In that world, if the community, the sharing community, wants to make use of the GPS, they need map information. So there's an Open Maps project, which is, there's a bunch of Open Maps projects, and that's pretty neat. So there's all these people trying to share all different kinds of information in the way that we've been sharing software for a really long time. I want to look at how one of those organizations is shared, and that's Creative Commons. And the reason I choose Creative Commons is because they're the biggest of the free software clones. They're the most successful, they've got the most mind share, they're producing lots of really good stuff. And how they went about it was actually pretty interesting. What they chose to take and what they chose not to take is really interesting. Now, Creative Commons started with licensing, right? Larry Lessig is a lawyer. He had a legal hammer. The problem looked like a legal nail. So he hit it, and we got a license. And it did hurt that he was modeling what he was doing on free and open source software, where licensing seems to be the big feature. So he created what's known as the Creative Commons licenses. And this was his gift to the world. Unfortunately, licensing in the Creative Commons world suffers from all the same problems as licensing in the software world, right? Nobody knows what license they're using. There are a plethora of Creative Commons licenses, and they have names like CC BY SA, CCNC something alphabet soup. There are a lot of people who believe that they are under a Creative Commons license, full stop. We have no idea what that means. I mean, that could be any one of several licenses in dozens of languages. So there's this problem within the Creative Commons community, just like in the software community. No one knows what license they're using. Nobody reads the license. Wow. Has anyone in here read a Creative Commons license? Liar! Liar! I want to talk to you afterwards. No, that's great. So which one did you read?
A few of them. I was looking to you and want to put a video out.
Okay.
We're a free software group. We're getting the wrong license. I think we're offensive for speakers.
Okay, fair enough. And do you know which license you settled on?
Creative Commons, no attribution, commercial use, UK, which is out of date. That's an issue with it apparently as well. So I can tell you what the actual string is.
There you go. Nobody knows what license they're using. So, you know, and because there are a lot of options in that license. I mean, every phrase in that string he just rattled off is a different bit that you're twiddling. And it's difficult to actually keep track of all this stuff, especially if you're licensing a variety of material in a variety of contexts. But nobody reads the license because they think they know what Creative Commons means. I mean, there was a Flickr. Are you all familiar with Flickr? Flickr is a photo sharing service. And one of the options you can use when you sign up for Flickr is to upload your photos to Flickr and tag it so that it's Creative Commons licensed. And there are various bits you can twiddle to make sure you get the right license, but there's an awful lot of confusion in what those licenses say. There was a lawsuit recently in America where, somebody put a photo on Flickr. A priest of some kind took a photo at a church event of one of his parishioners, and uploaded it all to Flickr and checked the box that said, yeah, share. I like to share. And that photo was taken by a cell phone company in Australia. I think it was Australia. And used in a commercial. And the photo was used in a fairly disparaging way, I understand. I haven't actually seen it, the commercial or the photo, but I'm told that the young lady who was humiliated on national television in a country she'd probably never been to, but still, was upset about this. And, she hadn't signed any sort of model release. The guy didn't really have the rights to, use it in this manner. It was a giant mess. And when you start to unpack the mess, what you find out is that nobody understood what rights they were giving away when they checked the Creative Commons box. And what's more, there were people involved who had never heard of Creative Commons, and then there were people involved who, having checked the box, had no idea what checking the box meant. And you unpack it and you just find an awful lot of ignorance about the Creative Commons. But what you also find is an awful lot of blame, because the Creative Commons, like, oh, I checked the box, I gave permission, and everyone wants to blame Creative Commons. Creative Commons was actually sued on this point. Luckily, they were let out of the lawsuit very quickly when more details came out. But the point is that nobody read the license, nobody understood the license, and nobody's enforcing the license. I mean, there aren't any Creative Commons enforcement lawsuits that I'm aware of in any jurisdiction on any planet that Creative Commons has reached thus far. So what that means is that Creative Commons licensing looks a lot like free software licensing. The license is not the thing that is driving, from a legal perspective, that is driving the creativity here. In addition to these problems, the Creative Commons licenses also have additional problems. One is the alphabet soup that we talked about earlier. There's a bunch of licenses. There's a public domain license, a share-alike license, a commercial use license, an attribution license, and you can mix and match these options in all sorts of combinations, some of which combinations map out to licenses and some of which don't. So it's a strange hash function, right? You don't actually know if there's anything in the bucket till you get there. On top of that, there's multiple translations of these licenses. These licenses exist in lots of different languages. They've been translated so that other people can use them. Now, I don't know if there are any lawyers in this room, but translating a license in this manner is extremely rare. Because, translating to other human languages is very hard to do. Trying to do that while also transposing to another legal system is probably, to some degree, impossible. And the way these licenses, you have the same exact license in two different languages, how those licenses interact with each other is a little bit of a mystery to some people, to some legal scholars looking at the issue. And the upshot of all this is that the Creative Commons organization publishes a bunch of licenses that they can't even read. Like, no one on their staff can actually read this license because it's all translated by volunteers. And it turns out that, legally, this creates a mess. If you want the license to be a really good legal instrument, translation is not the way to go. That's not your strategy. But local language licensing is great messaging. It's a great way to reach people. And so, they've got all the problems that free software has magnified. Free software has a few dominant licenses. Most of our licenses, all our licenses that I'm aware of are in English, and most of them are fairly short, fairly easy. And we've had 20 years of community education to sort of tell people what these licenses mean. Creative Commons lacks all of that. And so their licensing is immature compared to free software licensing. But again, mission accomplished, right? Everything's a mess. Success! Creative Commons licensing is a huge success. People are using these licenses, all over Flickr, all over the internet. There's people publishing novels with this stuff. There's people publishing textbooks with this stuff. There's been an explosion. There are entire websites devoted to just grabbing this material and giving it away. There's a website called CC Mixter, which is Creative Commons music samples that you can remix into new music, where people post a cappella lyrics, and other people post beats, and other people post raps, and then other people come along, gather all the material, make new songs, and share it with each other. It's just a creative party, and they're all having a great time. I call that mission accomplished, right? All these people sharing and creating together happily as a community with no legal friction, that's success. Despite the fact that the licensing on the back end is kind of a mess. So let's look at what's behind Creative Commons. Let's go back to our foundation and try to figure out which of these three pieces of the foundation Creative Commons is resting on. The first one we talked about earlier was freedom. The free software movement has very specific articulated ethics. Creative Commons does not. In fact, Creative Commons seems to go out of its way to avoid this kind of language. There's no attempt on the part of Larry Lessig or the people at Creative Commons to articulate a moral imperative for sharing. There's never any sort of railing against people creating proprietary content, proprietary media. There is no attempt to convince other people that proprietary media is wrong on any sort of ethical level.
Haven't some of the licenses been given free culture definition status?
The question of who gets to decide what is free culture or not is a whole other issue. But we won't go there tonight, I hope. So one of the ways that you can see that there is not this push to require freedom is that one of the most popular Creative Commons licenses includes a non-commercial use term, which is the exact opposite of the way the free software world works. No prominent free software license prohibits commercial use. In fact, quite the opposite. Most of the time, free software licenses are really, really happy. Free software licensors are really, really happy to see their work get used in commercial settings. That's part of how you get it out there. That's part of how you share it. That's part of the ethics of everybody using it for whatever purpose to build new and better things. It's how you create an ecosystem.
Isn't that the major difference between the software side and the Creative Commons anyway? And that you can use a Creative Commons license that specifically denies the next person to actually make modifications and improve them.
Yes. The Creative Commons licenses, some of them are specifically designed not to create more freedom. Some of them are specifically designed to include restrictions against free reuse of the material. And I'm not trying to bash Creative Commons here. There are very specific reasons why they take the approach they take, specific to their domain and their mission in the world. But I do want to highlight the difference, right? One of the foundational pieces of free software is missing in Creative Commons. The second thing is the ecosystem. As you were saying, without this commitment to sharing alike, to giving back, without this requirement in the license that people who use your material also pass on freedoms, it's very hard to create an ecosystem because value keeps leaving your ecosystem. People create modifications, derivative works, and they lock them up in their own use, and they don't contribute them back. or value gets locked into your ecosystem in ways that makes it not useful to other people because it contains restrictions, like non-commercial use only. And so they've got the brakes on the ecosystem, right? Just as you're trying to launch into that explosive growth phase, you've got all this friction, all this drag, preventing you from getting there. So they're, maybe they will eventually manage to create an ecosystem, but they certainly haven't yet. They certainly don't have the best toys, right? There's, the cultural value of works being produced outside of Creative Commons is very high in proportion to the cultural value of stuff being created inside, which is not to say there's not a lot of quality in Creative Commons works, but just in terms of quantity times quality, you have a lot more activity outside. So they haven't quite managed to get the ecosystem together, and maybe that'll change, but they certainly haven't done it yet. What they do have is that third piece, which is sharing is cool. The entire messaging structure of Creative Commons is geared towards the joy of creation, towards explaining to everyone, hey, come play with us, create new works, have the freedom of using other people's stuff, creating new stuff in any way you want. Rip it, mix it, burn it, share it. They're focused on the one piece of the foundation, and that is their entire foundation, so they're comparatively on a slimmer foundation than free software. But they have inhabited this space very, very, very well. They've got one message, and they are delivering it. And that's the only thing they care about, right? They're not going to try to work on freedom issues. They're not, I've never heard them talk about ecosystem issues. All they're talking about is just trying to convince more people to share, to come create new things with them. So, Creative Commons built a movement consciously modeled on free software, but also quite consciously modeled only on one piece of free software, right? Larry Lessig happens to be a really smart guy, and he's put a lot of thought into his project when he launched it, and he realized that this was the way to go, that this was the piece that content producers, media producers, were going to respond to most. And so he started with that. And of course, he could articulate a bunch of freedom issues tomorrow. He could roll over and start, really trying to concentrate on building an ecosystem and moving the licenses towards freedom-oriented licenses, right? There's tons of room for growth in this area. Creative Commons is this relatively young movement. But right now, they've got this one slender foundation, and they are building high on top of it, and building very well.
When did he write the first one? When did this start?
I want to say 01, 02. I don't quite remember, but it was around then. So, a slender foundation with no ethical underpinning and no ecosystem. Instead, they've got a community of sharing. And this goes back to what I said earlier about the license translations being really great messaging. If you're not worried about your licenses being legal instruments, it turns out getting local people in other countries to translate the license is a really good way to jumpstart a community of sharing in that country. Yes?
Do you think that the license is further on this, or do you think that the actual software platforms and things like Flickr and the social network is no longer a show? Because
technology.
It's going together at the same time.
Technology, there's been an explosion in technology that makes it easy to share. Absolutely. That has spurred a lot of the activity. But the fact is, we could have all that technology without people sharing in this way. Look, the protections that you get in a Creative Commons license are not hard protections. You could make a list of the things you want done and not done very easily in just a few lines. You don't need Creative Commons. If you want to dedicate your work to the public domain, you don't need a Creative Commons public domain license, right? We had the public domain checkbox easy. So they've got to create a community of sharing. And the question is building only on one piece of the foundation enough? But the real question, I guess, is enough for what? What is the goal? What defines success? in Creative Commons? And I think that's a very difficult question to answer because it's hard to have that kind of definition without the ethical underpinnings, without the, hard work at the beginning of thinking about where this is all going. And I'm sure Larry has thought about where this is all going, but he hasn't articulated it. He hasn't given us his grand design of where he sees this going in the future, which again, is fairly different from how things work in the free software world. In the free software world, Richard Stallman is forever giving speeches about what's coming next, what his goals are, where the technology is headed, why he believes that certain actions need to be taken. Larry is not playing that role. He's not articulating that stuff. And again, this is two different approaches, and both of them are working. So I said enough for what? And, my own personal point of view is that the way this takes off is when you finally turn the corner on the ecosystem, when the inducement to participate is that all these other people are participating, and the efficiencies of participating are great, and the wealth of material is just so great that it becomes irresistible. It becomes something that you want to pull in and participate in. And that ecosystem, there are a lot of things that push people into it, social, economic, creativity, all these things. And once they turn that corner, that to me seems like at least a definition of short-term success. Will they get there? I don't know. It's still extremely early in the life of the Creative Commons movement. But one thing they could do to help them get there, maybe, is to look at the other two pieces of the foundation, is to widen their foundation and to build upon other pieces, right? They're so far, as I can tell, not focused on building an ecosystem, not focused on articulating freedoms. And I would argue that if they were to take the steps of trying to identify what their core values are, what their ethics are, what drives them, that might be something valuable for them as a community, so that everyone can understand what they have in common with each other. And so those people can continue to work together to build that ecosystem, to build that engine for explosive growth. And that's my own personal point of view, and I might be right and I might be wrong, but that is the case I've been trying to make tonight. So the lessons that I want to draw from this discussion of Creative Commons and free software is that a license is not a foundation. I really like what you said earlier, it's insurance. I think that's exactly right. Writing licenses is easy. Anybody can sit down and write a license. You don't even need to be a lawyer. I mean, you might not write the best license, but most lawyers don't write the best licenses. I mean, there's a reason why we're on version 3 of the GPL and version 3 of the Creative Commons license. I mean, times change, legal situations change, unforeseen things happen, corners crop up. But a license is not a founding. It is not sufficient to found a social movement. It is not sufficient to inaugurate a community. Nobody rallies around a piece of paper. Nobody rallies around a license. And we can see that when we look at all the other licenses that are out there that sort of die on the vine. Some of them are actually pretty good licenses, but none of them are in common use because they could not manage to gather communities around them. They couldn't manage to gather people together to create a community of sharing and an ecosystem. A license is not a fountain. Freedom matters. I believe that one of the main strengths of the free software movement is its emphasis on freedom. I think I've talked a little bit about that today, but the main thrust of my argument there, I'll just repeat for you real quick, which is that it is the freedom, the copyleft clause in the freedom-oriented license that is required to truly create the ecosystem that results in adoption. That's it. That is the entire argument. The next lesson, people love to share. Every time a community has even formed as a nucleus, people have gotten involved, gotten creative, and started contributing and loved that process of creation and contribution. It makes people happy. This is what pulls a lot of other people in. A lot of people get involved in free software because of this. I like to create neat technology and share it. They stay because they learn about freedom, but not a lot of people who have no clue about free software wake up one day with notions of freedom and technology in their mind. Some do, but not many. Sharing is key. Sharing is important. People love it, and that is definitely one of the biggest pieces of how the freedom to share movement is going to work in many different areas. And the last and biggest point is just that the ecosystem matters. This notion of having a pool to draw from is really, without that, you don't get the growth in production, and you don't get the growth in use or in distribution. So, mission accomplished, right? Congratulations. You know the foundation. You've got an idea of what the ingredients are to create a movement. You know the role of a license in that movement. You can apply this knowledge. And, let's say you create a really great free software movement or free whatever movement. The only other question is, now what? Now what happens? And so, I don't want to talk a lot about how to lead a mature movement, because this was about growing small movements. So all I'm going to say is very briefly that if you do manage to grow your movement the way free software has managed to do it, eventually you pull in diverse stakeholders, right? Remember the ecosystem, all these people who come into your family. Not, they're in your house, eating your food and sharing food with you, but not because they believe in your value of sharing. They're doing it because they like to eat. But suddenly, you're in the center of this. The de facto rule maker within this ecosystem. You're responsible for the licenses. You set standards. You mediate disputes. You make the public statements that the ideologues follow, i.e., you're Richard Stallman. At that point, maybe you have an obligation, although you came to this loving freedom, you have an obligation to the stakeholders who came to it not for the freedom and not for the sharing, but for the ecosystem. And that obligation has to take the form, to some degree, of addressing the concerns of the people in your movement. You have become a government, right? Where once it was, we were doing stuff, we were a duocracy. I did a bunch of stuff, and therefore I had some sort of say over what happened. At some point, your movement has to shift from a duocracy to a democracy. And that's what happened in GPL v3. We published lots and lots of drafts of the license. We published rationale documents to explain the changes we wanted to make to the license. We convened working groups, conference calls, gave interviews, put up a public comment system on the web. We did all these things to gather all this information. And lest we be accused of putting on a show of gathering this information, it should be noted that the first draft of the license we produced looked very different from the draft that ultimately was accepted and used and was published. And some of the key clauses that we internally wanted very much in the license didn't make it through the process of listening to the community and finding out what they wanted. And the point of all this is that at some point, free software grew up. Free software became an institution that needed less informal structure, that needed slightly more formal structure. And so we've started to edge in that direction. And so the one lesson from this that I want to sort of put out there is that maybe it didn't have to wait 20 years. Maybe we could have been a little bit more mature a little bit sooner. And getting the democratic input of our community is another way to found a community, is another way to get people involved. Now, that's not a tack we took, but maybe that is a piece that could become part of the foundation of the next community. And I don't know whether that's possible or not. I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm speculating. So, I know I said I would talk about free software, Creative Commons, and then all these other smaller, more nascent movements. But I also see that I'm running out of time. So, I'd like to take some questions. I'm sorry, I really did not mean to talk this long. I will take some questions if anyone has any.
John?
Sure.
So, given that the whole freedom culture, software, all the other areas is kind of gathering pace at the moment, you're seeing more and more of it in the mainstream. Just your opinion on why we're also seeing at the same time increases in sort of legislation countering that, copyright legislation, patent legislation going through, seeing the states of Europe. Obviously, that's
Well, look, force is the last resort of people with bad arguments. And legal force is the first resource of people with bad lawyers, right? I mean, you're seeing a lot of legislation because we're winning. There was a time when nobody cared about free software. Nobody needed to worry about our standards. Nobody needed to worry about our technology. That time has passed. And that's what I say, when I say we're winning, that's what I mean. I mean, when you see the opposition ramp up against you, you know it means that they think you're something to oppose. And there's a lot of truth there. We've got a lot of momentum, we've got a lot of energy, and we've got a compelling case for adoption of our technology. That you're going to see a lot of movement against free and open source software precisely because it is reaching a convincing point. And there's a fear that it might reach a tipping point, right? That's the biggest fear on the other side of this issue, is that we reach a tipping point where suddenly the network effects on our side of the table become too compelling and they just start losing market share. And once that happens, you know, this is the like free software singularity that we all dream of. I mean, and yeah, it's science fiction to a degree. Will it happen? Will it happen? No. It's not going to happen anytime soon, right? We're not 5 years away from this beautiful dream of free software being the only software out there. It's going to be a long, long, and hard-won fight to put our technology out there and improve it. And we're going to have to keep on making sure that we produce the best technology and make the most compelling case for its use. And as we do that, they're going to keep trying to use legal structures against us, social structures against us, and business structures against us. That's the nature of competing in the marketplace, is that the other side is always going to fight dirty. So, any other questions? Sure.
Do you know, as a lawyer, what's going to happen in the near future with the patenting system in America and Europe?
Wow. That's a big question, right? The question was, do I know as a lawyer what's going to happen to the patent system? I mean, I can tell you, the short answer is no. The long answer is that those of us in the free software world are obviously very concerned about patents. GPL version 3 contained explicit clauses addressing the patent issue, which is a big change from GPL v2. And it addressed it in, it's probably the most complicated section of the license. There's a section in there that is specifically in response to the Microsoft Novell deal. So patents are a concern. And our belief and our hope is that the patent concern doesn't just affect free software, and that the business world in technology is slowly waking up to the fact that patents are not necessarily working as well as they should be. And there's a lot of people who agree that reform needs to happen. We're fighting about what kind of reform needs to happen, but the belief that reform needs to happen is the first step, and that's growing. There's a lot of people out there who see major problems in the patent system. I mean, IBM spent untold tens of millions of dollars in the SCO litigation. And they won, right? The price of winning was tens of millions of dollars. Many tens of millions of dollars. And that's winning the battle. Imagine what the price of losing just one of these battles is. I mean, when companies come to you with their bowl in hand and they say, I have a patent or I have a copyright, And you have to defend against that, and they have nothing, no surface upon which you can hit back. That is an expensive proposition. And some of those patents are going to be good, which is why a lot of those cases settle. I mean, some of them are cheaper to settle than to fight, even if you're right. SCO is always going to get fought just because people are unwilling to let bad patents win, bad rights win. But it's expensive either way. The patent system is going to get expensive on the litigation side. And that's going to become a compelling argument to some people in the technology field. The problem is that when the technology companies finally wake up and realize that the patent system is dragging them down, is more of a liability than an asset, they're not going to be able to change the system. The day the technology companies wake up and decide they are all on our side of the argument, they will be just as stuck as we are. Because if you think the technology companies have a lot of lobbyists, all you need to do is look at how many lobbyists the pharmaceutical companies have. They have more lobbyists, more lobbying power, deeper, more long-standing connections in the countries that are patent important. United States, Germany, right? These are countries with deep pharmaceutical resources, as well as deep technological resources. And on the pharmaceutical side of the fence, people are pretty happy with the patent system. A lot of people think it's working pretty well. They don't want to change anything. And if you think what happens when the technology lobbyists try to fight the pharmaceutical lobbyists? I mean, I guarantee you, the pharmaceutical lobby wins that one 9 days out of 10, right? Like we should go Google, find out what happens when the tech patent lawyers go up against the pharmaceutical patent lawyers in amateur softball and see who wins. I bet you it's pharmaceutical every time. This is going to be a problem. So the problem is that the road to patent reform is long. The road is long. The road to patent reform through legislation is long, I should say. There is some hope that we can convince some judges, and we have arguments that are lined up to do that. But that's a different proposition, and that's hard. So yeah, if you think we're going to solve the patent system through legislation, not going to happen soon. We haven't even convinced the first industry we need to convince yet. So that's going to be an issue. Any other questions? Sure.
You mentioned that the GPL3 changed a lot from your initial proposals. What were the things that you would have most liked to have been in there that didn't get in?
Well, if you can search, the drafts are all available online, fsf.org. So you can read the first draft, and you can read the license as it exists, and you can see the differences. That's the first answer. That's the full answer. The more specific answer is that there is a clause in the GPL, GPL v3 draft 1, that was very important to us. It was the Affero clause. And how many people here know what the Affero clause was? I knew it was going to be you guys. So your obligation to distribute source code under the GPL is triggered by your distribution of software. Basically, if I give you a piece of software under the GPL, I also have to give you the source code to it and the rights to it. In the modern world we live in, a lot of software gets used by people who never receive a copy of it. When you go to a website, you don't get the source code to that website. When you go on Google, they don't hand you a copy of their search engine software. They let you use it. You're an end user with no access to the binary source. To the binary code. And what that means is that GPL software running on the web in network services does not require end users to get access to source code. So if you're Google, you can take a bunch of free software, make a bunch of changes to it, build your service on it, and let the world use it without ever give anything back to the ecosystem. This is what's known as the web services loophole. Without the distribution, you don't need to give out the rights or the source code. And that's what web services do. They give you access to use their computers, but they don't give you the software. what the Affero clause said in draft 1 was that if you let someone interact with your website or network service of any kind, and you've got GPL software behind there, you also have to give them a copy of the source code under the GPL. We just closed the loophole. Now this was very controversial, and we were going to break an awful lot of people's business models. People were upset about it, were crying about it, but we like free software. We're free software partisans. We wanted to live in a world that had more of this freedom in it, so we stuck it in the license. It was too controversial. There were too many people who couldn't actually agree on what we should do with this, so it eventually fell out of the license. And, as a result, we created a parallel license called the Affero GPL v3, and it contains this missing clause as well as a few other things, and it closes the loophole. So if you are a producer of GPL software, and you want to require this additional step, you can use the Affero GPL to close the web services loophole. And I encourage all of you to take a look at it. The AGPL is a really good license. In fact, I prefer it to the GPL. And I would like to see it used more often by more people in more projects. So I encourage you to look at the AGPL and, maybe it'll be right for your project, especially if you're building websites or other network services. Are there any other questions? Sure.
I just wondered if you feel that part of the challenge with free and open source software, open source generally, is that business models haven't really evolved to deal with this new ecosystem that we have. And until people can figure out how to keep their businesses profitable and partake in the ecosystem, you're always going to have this friction and challenge.
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of concern about business models, but man, there's an awful lot of people making an awful lot of money on free software. I mean, there's a reason why Linus Torvalds gets paid to hack on the kernel. I mean, there's a reason why the Samba team gets paychecks, right? The software is useful to somebody, and that somebody at some point is willing to pay for it. There's a lot of my clients are people who hack on free software, but also have business models around that free software. Consulting, customizing, merchandising, advertising, whatever it is. There are an awful lot of business models around it. Some of them are even, shrink wrapping and selling this stuff, right? Including the old business model. That still exists. Every business model that exists with proprietary software exists to some degree with free and open source software. Now, you might have to be a little bit more creative. You might have to be a little bit fancier around the edges, and you might have to think a little bit harder and diversify your notion of what an acceptable business model is. You might also have to realize that, you're going to make a very good living on free and open source software, but you might never be the next Bill Gates. And that's probably okay for a lot of people. The vast majority of businesses built around software are small businesses, are small mom and pop shops. That's true on both the proprietary and the free side of the fence. And that hasn't changed with free software. I mean, most people out there are small companies making free software and making a living, a very comfortable living, but none of them are becoming giant, titans of industry. On the other hand, just like in the proprietary world, you have a few people that are making lots and lots of money in free software. I mean, look, MySQL just sold for lots and lots of money, and the people who founded that company are, extremely wealthy right now. Google is built on free software. They're not giving it away, but they're using it, and they're giving back by creating some on the side, right? There's people making money either using or producing free software in some sense all over the place. And that applies to people who are eking out extra cash as students, to people who are supporting their family, to people who are running small 5 to 10 person businesses, all the way up to people who have hundreds of millions of dollars. All the models are there. The business models are there. You can find them, you can use them, but you can't complain about them to me, because you'll get the talk I just gave you. So I didn't mean to harangue you, but I don't think that the problem is there's a lack of business models.
No.
I think there's a lack of imagination.
Yeah, not a lack of business model, but a lack of imagination on the part of people who are still invested in the old models.
Sure.
People are
Sure.
slow to move with the times.
Well, I mean, whenever times change, some people change faster than others. People who are heavily invested in the old system always resist the change because they have the least to gain and the most to lose. That is the nature of social and economic change. And it doesn't work any differently in the software world than it does in any other world. That's just the reality of it. And I don't worry about convincing those people. That's not the task. The task is to keep the change moving forward. At some point, they will change, or they'll get left behind. Or, we'll live in a bifurcated world where they're eking out a living and we're eking out a living and everyone's happy. But convincing any one specific company or producer or party is not the goal. The goal is to keep the change moving forward and make the compelling case so that when someone is ready, they'll jump into it. So I think I'm out of time, and I just want to leave you with just that one thought. It's not the license, it's the community. And if you guys want to found movements in other areas, I encourage you to think of it as creating communities, not as writing licenses. So thank you very much. I'll take more questions afterwards outside in the hallway, if anyone has them. So thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, James, on behalf of the organisation here this evening. That was fascinating. I'd like to think that communities across the world can come together to solve some of the humankind's major problems they're facing at the moment. And I think the free software model is a good example of how that might be achieved. We've talked a little bit about the future. Next week we have a talk on the Enigma machines from a speaker from Bletchley Park. That's going to be on Wednesday the 9th of April at 7:30 at the Holiday Inn, the Royal Victoria one, not the one in Rotherham. You're most welcome to come along to that. It's likely to be very busy. We can take about 100, Richard? Yeah. So 7 for 7:30 again. So it's there's going to be an Enigma machine there. You'll get a chance to have a bit of hands-on if you want to. And of course, that's all about the history of computing.
Our next meeting, I can't remember what it is, I haven't got the programme with you, but it's on the web, on the South Yorkshire branch website, is the following Thursday, so it'll be the 17th, I think. And that will be here. Please get the South Yorkshire branch of BCS meets every month during the season, which is October through to May, and everyone's welcome to our meetings, and they're always advertised on the web. And remind people that I brought down some meetings from Sheffield. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
So finally, before you go, I'd like to just thank James again in the usual way for his talk tonight.
I have a blog at hackervisions.org. I just started a couple of weeks ago. I have no idea what's going to happen there, but I do talk about some of these issues. Hackervisions.org. Take a look at it. If you're interested in these sorts of ideas, I'd love to hear you talk to me through that website or by email. Again, you can reach me through that website. So thank you.
Safe journey home. That's the first hour.
I'm afraid for the Enigma talk, I'm going to be in the late,
Right.
Anyone hasn't signed
Hi,
the form,
I saw you come in.
so.
Yeah. Let me deal with this.